Forest Woods Media presents 20th Century Poets. Listen to a minute commentary on Josephine Jacobsen, poetry consultant to the Library of Congress, 1971 to 1973, a position Congress would later term US Poet Laureate. She wrote essays, criticism, newspaper articles, and short stories. But poetry is what gave Josephine Jacobsen so much literary acclaim. She called her poems work of refuge, apprehension, and triumph. Others called her elegant and named Josephine an American classic. Elegance is just one way to talk about how aesthetics are contained within the poem, and her poetic procedures came from craft and form. She believed lyric poets were discouraged many times over the years and that the formalists were in the minority, but said, "I continued to write poems of a varied formalness during a prolonged period, which was in many quarters deemed totally unacceptable, and I managed to survive, poetically speaking." She wrote architectural poems, beautifully constructed, whether in end rhymes, line schemes, exact rhyme patterns, inner rhyme, extended rhyme. Always a traditional armature shapes the poem. Her themes are of time and loss and communication. And beneath the surface of her work, there's danger everywhere. We look at her poem, My Uncle as a Child, and see an acute perception of human behavior. She watches the warped, the unnatural, the painful, and puts it in a frame we can understand. Her poem, Noon, for example, gives us a tranquil scene, and in the last 4 lines, suddenly a frigate dives down to its prey. In Josephine's poetry, total peace cannot exist. She subscribed to Keats's idea of negative capability, where a poet finds beauty without understanding the mysteries and the terror possible inside the beauty. She spent a life observing animals and birds that became topics for her poems. They represented a world without speech. The inability to communicate haunted Josephine's writing, and in her work, humans move through life in a world inhabited by multiple forms of life, and they have no bridge to communicate. Human communication is also a theme. In Winter Castle, where the sonnets show preservation of love, we have a difficult reality in the world, trying to speak to one another. When Josephine published her first poems, there were few women poets to show the way. Her mother thought it proper for Josephine's brother to go to college and for Josephine to make a social debut instead. Yet the same mother read to her continuously and presented a broad range of literature and lived to see her daughter flourish in the spirit of poetry. When Josephine Jacobsen was first published, at age 11, people came up to the newspaper kiosk in New York to buy the magazine. She hid behind a corner watching them and said she would never forget her amazement. She knew she was a professional poet. She said that was a special occasion.
This was a poem that I am very, very fond of. I mean, I'm not too fond of a lot of my poems because there's always something that got away, that I didn't do. But
this is one of my favorites too.
Well, I had been doing a lot of reviewing, and I had been reading a lot of just awful poetry. And I think I was in a little bit of a tantrum when I wrote this, and then I was reading some superb poetry. And you always want to say something about that, and nobody has ever said it satisfactorily. I suppose Marlowe came closest to it, but nobody, I think, has ever described what the reading of a great poem is. So, well, this is my own attempt. Gentle reader, late in the night, when I should be asleep, under the city stars, in a small room, I read a poet, not a versifier, not a hot-shot ethic monger laying about him, not a diary of lying about in cruel, cruel beds crying. A poet, dangerous and steep. Oh God, it peels me, juices me like a press. This poetry drinks me, eats me, gut and marrow, until I exist in its jestest sorrow, until my juices feed a savage sight that runs along the lines bright as beasts' eyes. The rubble splays to dust, city, book, bed, leaving my ears lust, saying like Molly, yes, 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 oh yes.
I'm Grace Cavalieri. Funding is provided by the Snippet Fund. Our producer is Jack Tarashuk. Our engineer is Mike Turpin.